Hello, this is CUDA and Open Lab seminar of the Cultural Data Analytics Open Lab on November 17, 2025. And today it is our greatest pleasure to have a very, very early guest from the University of British Columbia, Vancouver. So it's really, really early over there. And the guest is Professor Dr. Laura K. Nelson, who is a professor for computational social science. And today we will sort of like continue a little bit the series that we sort of like were already in last week, which is sort of a very methodological thing. Why variance matters, particularly in relation to AI. So Laura, the stage is yours. We are absolutely excited to have you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here. And this is some new ideas that I'm working through now. So I'm very happy to hear thoughts or critiques or ideas about where to go next with this. Just trying to explore kind of this new world of LLMs, because my claim here, is that variance matters more than bias, particularly for large language models. And this is different than what a lot of computational social scientists have been talking about with the methods going back to 2010 with static word embeddings. And so exploring how large language models are different, a different beast, I guess, a different thing we should be thinking about. So I'm going to kind of do this in 4 sections. I'm going to talk about the way we've talked about bias with static word embeddings, and then talk about variance and why that is turning out to be a really key pivot point for large language models in particular, or what we can be doing with large language models, kind of the opportunities for the future, and the possibility or perhaps impossibility of steering variance when it comes to large language models and the really tricky issues that come with attempts to steer anything with large language models, given the largeness that they are. So that's what I'll do. So I'll start with bias. Bias is the kind of main thing that social scientists have been discussing with machine learning methods and continue to discuss now with AI methods. So bias and static embedding. So one of the large language model, not large language models, the word embedding models that was released in 2014 was really a pivot point in computational methods when it came to cultural analytics or computational social science. So in 2014, Google released their word-to-vec model, which was based on Google Books and Google News, and it was the largest word embedding model we had seen thus far. It was really the only large word embedding model we had seen thus far. And immediately people said, oh my goodness, this model is great, but it's biased. It is revealing, in particular, gender biases that are embedded in language. And so the vectors that were closest to the she vector are homemaker, nurse, receptionist, librarian. The vectors closest to the he vector were maestro, skipper, protege, philosopher. And there was some what the Google researchers saw at the time, very problematic gender stereotypes. So women is to sewing as men is to carpentry, women is to nurse as men is to surgeon. And this was embedded also in appropriate he-she analogies. Women is to queen as men is to king. So the kind of the typical analogy that people were really excited that word embeddings were able to solve. Women is to waitress as men is to waiter. But the Google researchers and other machine learning researchers at the time tried to figure out how to subtract out what they saw as problematic gender stereotypes while you keep in the productive gender gender analogies, mother and father, etc. But social scientists and digital humanists and cultural analytics saw really awesome potential in these early static word embedding models. And so using the gender stereotypes, but other cultural stereotypes that were accurately embedded and encoded in these models to then measure how these stereotypes changed over time or how they presented in language. And so, for example, as women entered higher education in higher rates, they became more culturally associated with studying rather than intellect. So women are in higher ed at the same rates of men, but men are intelligent and women are just hardworking and studying. And so it opened up kind of a floodgates for how we could audit cultural and social stereotypes, bias, really social bias embedded in language. It was a very exciting moment for computational social scientists, cultural analytics, etc. We've seen just a huge amount of work come out around this. So we can also measure, this has been measured used to measure morality and words. So healthy is associated with morality, and being overweight or overeating is associated with immorality, right? How does a algorithm learn the cultural meaning of being fat? How do humans learn the cultural meaning of being fat? And so this turned out to be a very powerful approach and a very powerful way to model biases in language, which social scientists and cultural analytics, computational humanities people have been claiming over and over and over again that one of the reasons why stratification, why gender inequality persists is because it's encoded very deeply in the language we use. It is deeply embedded in our cultural landscape here. And word embeddings, static word embeddings, gave us the opportunity to measure this directly and measure how it changed over time. So I used these methods long ago to try to measure intersectional experiences in the 19th century US South. So this is just static embeddings. I trained myself on 19th century narratives of the US South. Can show things like, so you can use vector addition, right, with static word embeddings and say not just women, but can we intersect women with race? So black women, white women, show that black women and white women are closer to the domestic sphere than men, not surprising. But you can also show that black women, when you do vector addition, are closer to the economic sphere compared to anybody else, and white women are closer to the cultural sphere. So you can start to really dig into the different intersecting kind of associations and biases that are embedded in language here. And this is not all that surprising, right? Women are in the domestic sphere. Black women are closer to the economy. In the 19th century US South, they were forced to work or had to work. So not all that surprising, but you can pick up this kind of discursive associations in language itself, in the text itself, but then you can start to push a little bit more. So authority, right? When you have these intersecting racial and gender regimes, as you did in the 19th century US South, where there was literal enslavement based on race, but there was also strong gender schemes in the US South. Who had more discursive authority? It turns out the gender schema was stronger than the racial schema here. So black men and white men were closer to the authority than white women, and closer to the authority vector than women. There was very little race effect, and black men actually were closer to the authority figure compared to white women. So the gender schema here swamped the racial schema when it came terms to discursive authority. So this is what all of this is to say. This is what static word embeddings gave us. They gave us the ability to quantify and measure social biases, cultural associations that were embedded in text, embedded in discourse that we could then make claims about, right? We can use them to audit the social world rather than subtract them out of the algorithms, which is what computer scientists were trying to do at the time, which is what you need to do if you're going to use these in systems, of course. So why does this work? Why are we able to measure these kind of use these methods to really audit the social and cultural world in the way that we did? We have theories from Wittgenstein about the way language works, right? Language games. So language words gain meaning as they are used in practice. They don't have a set meaning. This is just kind of standard philosophy here. They don't have a set meaning. They gain meaning as they are used in practice, as they are used in discourse, as we test out these words and build them as societies, as groups, as language communities, we build these meanings. And so those cultural and social associations that get embedded in language happen in this practical way as we build language with each other in written or spoken language, which then comes through with these methods, and they still do today, right? And so Mead, in my world, in social science, Mead talks about how this creates the self, right? The concept of ourself comes through this kind of practical interaction through language. So not only are we building meaning socially through words, we are developing our sense of self through those kind of shared languages. So when I say a word or I do a gesture, I can assume that it means the same thing to you as it means to me. When I say the word fat and it has a immoral connotation to me, I can assume that it also has an immoral connotation to you, because that's how language communities or communities, social worlds build up meaning in language. So we have these theories for this. We of course have theories about how power works in this as well. So Du Bois gives us this really powerful essay where he talks about double consciousness and says, Black Americans, this is again in the late 19th, early 20th century US South in the US, Black Americans do not have the same access to consciousness as white Americans do, because Black Americans will always be viewed by white Americans with contempt and pity. They don't have the same ability to say the way that I see myself is the same way that other people see me, the way that white Americans were able to. So he brings in, and many others, of course, brings in the concept of power to these kind of discursive meaning structures that actually they aren't always universally shared. And then word embeddings gave us the ability to kind of break down these vectors by race, by gender, by other kind of meaningful social and cultural constructs, really anything we wanted, right? We can use vector addition, vector subtraction, all sorts of mathematical ways of manipulating vectors to try to understand not only the shared meaning structures in these languages, in this discourse, but how power and inequality and differences also play on it, which is what I was trying to capture with intersectionality, right? Looking at the way that Black women experience the US South compared to white women. So Donna Haraway gives us this philosophical perspective here, which I think is coming back in a very interesting way with large language models, which is that perspective reigns supreme, right? We should be building knowledge through situated knowledges and partial perspectives. And that doesn't mean everything is subjective in terms of like not objective. It just means that when we're viewing the social and cultural world, you have to view it from the perspective in which you're trying to measure, right? Because people experience the world differently. It's forced on them differently. And so in this book chapter in New Literary History, which is relevant to the cultural analytics crowd, I'm not purely social science over here, I make this claim that situated knowledges and partial perspectives grounded in Donna Haraway's perspective is a framework for radical objectivity. We can now objectively measure the world from infinite different perspectives, but multiple different perspectives using computational methods. These high dimensional word embeddings and other methods as well gives us the ability to precisely measure how these perspectives play out in the real world. And so saying Black women experienced and the world was forced on them in a different way in the 19th century US South compared to white women is not a subjective claim, right? It's an objective claim about the way the world worked in the 19th century US South, the way the world works anywhere, but specifically in the 19th century US South. And so static word embeddings gave us the ability to train a model specifically on that data very precisely as we can get with vectors, which is more precisely, I claim, than with large language models. Try to precisely isolate the white women vector, the Black women vector, and see how that kind of changes the embeddedness in the rest of the institutions in that kind of discourse. And that is really how we can operationalize Donna Haraway's perspective here. And that is why I claim very strongly that machine learning is feminist. Not that it can be used in a feminist way, but that it is, at its kind of basis mathematical formulation, a feminist method. It operationalizes partial perspectives, situated knowledges in a very high dimensional way that allows us to kind of see the different ways that social and cultural associations get enacted in discourse, in text, and spoken word too, if we are looking at speech to text, etc. And so coming from kind of this long history of computational methods being developed through topic models and word embeddings gave us this very powerful tool to audit how bias is enacted in discursive and cultural and social systems. And so that's where we're coming from here. And the focus on bias there kind of made sense in the context of the methods and what we were doing. Which brings me to variance in the current mode. So we were focused on bias, how social biases get embedded in these methods. Computer scientists were focused on how to get bias out of these methods because they're using them for resume recommendation systems. But large language models are very different. And my argument here that I'm testing out and trying to develop is that variance actually is much more important than bias when it comes to large language models. So we've had much of the world has had fascination with making machines more human, making them have autonomous capabilities. So the bottom there is the mechanical Turk that was being passed around in the 18th and 19th century, who ostensibly could play chess by himself and was trotted out in front of Ben Franklin and different kings and nobles to wow them with the ability to play chess by itself. And then, of course, we get Alan Turing on the top, who foresaw a future where we could make machines that were indistinguishable from humans in terms of their intelligence. So large language models come from this long, they don't come from, but they follow this long history of wanting to give autonomous anthropomorphizing machines, giving them kind of human-like capabilities here. And now this is what we get. We have, you log into ChatGPT, you get what's on your mind today, ask me anything. And it's really quite astonishing. I probably don't have to go over for people in this room how astonishing these technologies have been, how human-like they are, how they are completely flawed in so many ways, but also really, really impressive in so many ways. And it's, of course, if you're in education, if you're in anything, it's really shaking the ground under us, right? It's really challenging a lot of what we thought about how we teach, how people learn, etc. And one of the interesting aspects of that is that we're anthropomorphizing them, and this has a benefit and a danger. But what's important about the technology itself is that they're not inherently as human-like as they are the way we interact with them, right? We have the base models, and the base models, if you've played with any of the base models, the large language base models from Llama or even GPT's base model, they're not very human sounding like. They can predict the next word, you can kind of force paragraphs out of them, but they don't have this kind of natural conversational rhythm to them. That comes from the instruction tuning, right? It comes from engineers laying on another layer on top of the base model to say, we want this to sound more human-like. So there's been a ton of work that goes on top of the large language base models. You train these large language models, and then you do all this extra work to get them to sound human. So you do reinforcement learning, you instruction tuning. That's where you get these just different personas. You get the kind of like the models that do whatever you ask them to do, that reinforce whatever you're thinking. That comes from the engineer's instruction tuning, right? To get them to sound more anthropomorphic. And there's some really awesome work out there that investigates kind of the consequences of doing that. But what social scientists are taking from this is kind of interesting to see to develop in development. So I'm going to pull a lot from the special issue of Sociological Methods in Research, which was one of the early attempts to really dig into what generative AI gives social science. And there's kind of different parts of the research world that it gives us, but I'm going to pull a lot from this when I talk about what large language models give us. And one of the things that people are doing, I'm going to get back to the anthropomorphizing and the kind of humanness of it. But first, we're still concerned about bias. Social scientists are. This was published in Bloomberg back in 2023. This is Midjourney. So engineers prompted Midjourney to make an image of somebody who is an architect, a lawyer, a CEO, etc., a politician. And then they looked at the skin tone that the image generator generated and found that lower wage workers tended to be depicted with darker skin versus higher wage kind of professional jobs tended to be depicted with lighter skin, right? So bias still matters. If we're using these in resume recommendation systems, bias still very much matters. This is just a few weeks ago. The cover of Nature was a paper by Doug Gerbert and others looking at the way that large language models actually assessed resumes. I talk about resumes a lot because this is pretty much everybody who applies for a job, their resume is going to be run through an AI system. And so this is really, really important if your ability to get a job is contingent on your ability to get through these AI systems. But they looked at how these large language models, I think specifically GPT-4, was assessing resumes, and they found that older men were rated at higher, their resumes were rated higher than younger women. So there was a clear social bias towards older men against younger women. This matters because everybody's resume is run through these resume recommendation systems. So if they are privileging older men, this really does matter in social systems. So we should think about bias. But the point here is that the whole kind of social science world is still hyper focused on bias. You'll see it over and over and over again in media stories, in papers. We should be talking about bias when it comes to large language models. But I don't think that's really the way we should be thinking about this for a very specific reason, which is large language models don't encode associations between words, which tend to encode bias the way that static word embeddings do. They are an amalgam. They kind of mush together this huge amount of text and language from all over the world. It's multilingual. Most of the models are multilingual, multicultural, and they smash them together, especially in the instruction tuning stage. And it becomes this kind of universal human that has never existed, will never exist. It's hyper intelligence in that it has access to way, way more knowledge than any single human would ever have access to. But it also has, because of that, it does not have the perspectives that humans does. Like getting back to Donna Haraway, it does not have that perspectival take on the world that is where kind of the language games come from. This is where all of our philosophy of language is saying comes from the perspective on it and the kind of practical applications of humans who don't have access to the entire kind of language world are negotiating meaning with one another through these kind of battling consciousnesses, right? That's what our philosophy of language comes from. The large language models just kind of obliterate that. They create this universal human that is this weird, never existing thing, and that has really serious consequences, and not because of bias. So an amalgam, as it's used in chemistry, is like the fusing together of mercurium and some other kind of metal here, and it's very, very important, very good properties for dentistry, but it fuses these things together so that it has its own properties, right? Makes this lattice, and that's what large language models are doing, but with human culture, not with metals here. So it creates this perspectiveless view of the world. There is no perspective. And that I think is really important. And empirically, I'm going to show what the consequences, the potential consequences of this are for large language models. This like smashing away perspective, which you can get with static word embeddings by training your own models by using word and vector addition and subtraction, etc. So empirically, I'm not sure what you guys are seeing here on the screen, but empirically, we're getting some very interesting output from these large language models. So this is from the special issue Sociological Methods and Research, looking at whether GPT-4 can simulate actual human samples from the General Social Survey. We see that in many ways they cannot, and in a very particular way. So this is the actual human distribution over a question, should the government do more to help the poor, right? We get a spike around 1 and 3. And then we get some answers across, and we see that GPT-4 just really focuses on 3, right? It just goes to the mean there. Do you think it should be possible for a pregnant woman to obtain a legal abortion if a woman wants it for any reason? The GSS full sample, yes, no, right? It's about a 60-40 split, which it has been for a long time. GPT-4 says yes. This is not because of the base model, right? This is not because the actual text that it's trained on is pro-abortion necessarily, but the instruction tuning on top could be swaying the GPT-4 model. This is an instruction tuned model to kind of answer in different ways. And so whether it's the base model or the instruction tuning, it is very much homogenizing the output from these models. There's very, very little variance in the way large language models are responding as humans. And we see this across study after study after study. There's very little settled fact when it comes to large language models. These are new technologies. They are developing technologies. The corporate world is trying to monetize them, so they're constantly changing these technologies. So there's not very much settled fact. But one of the things that I would say is more or less settled fact is that these models are very homogeneous. They have very little variance on them. So from the same special issue, how do generative large language models answer opinion polls? So a similar thing, can we prompt language models to answer opinion polls that humans have answered? And what these scholars found is there's very little social bias. So like things like age or gender or education are not correlated with error rates. these models aren't socially biased. There's some evidence that they don't predict opinions of women as much as men. The paper goes into kind of detail there, but more the kind of general conclusion from this is there's not an inherent social bias in these models that we see in like word embedding models here. And more importantly, they are not capturing the full variance of human responses here. And so these scholars label this machine bias. There is a bias in these. They don't accurately represent human opinions. They're not accurately simulating human subjects, but it is not because they're biased towards a certain social group or cultural group. It's because they do not capture the variance that humans have. Their answers are really just kind of centered around a very small area. So the scholars who wrote this paper call this machine bias. They have their own machine bias that is unlike any human bias that we've ever seen, and that is present in the training data. So this really is a completely different, it is modeling something completely different than what we had with like static word embeddings. And even if we look at encoder only models like BERT, it's homogeneous. It's really centered around a small part of the social space here. And so yet another paper, right? This is looking at how large language models are used to fill in open-ended survey responses. So more and more social scientists go to Mechanical Turk and Prolific, these crowdsourcing sites to answer surveys, to do experiments. And more often, the people who are on Mechanical Turk, the workers who are on Mechanical Turk, who are on Prolific, are pulling from large language models to answer surveys. So we have surveys who are being run on real humans, but humans are often pulling from it. And these scholars in this paper surveyed Prolific workers, surveyed Mechanical Turk workers, and found that a lot of them are actually using large language models to answer these survey questions that researchers are then analyzing as if humans wrote these answers. And then they looked at actual human responses that were known human responses that were done before large language models on a Prolific study. And then they had a Claude Gemini GPT-4 simulate answers to those open-ended survey responses compared to the humans. The humans are not very similar to one another, and the large language models are very similar to one another and to their own answers. So we're seeing these large language models are producing answers to open-ended survey responses, and this is happening in real life as well, that are very homogeneous. They're very similar compared to humans. And this is really the graphic I want to emphasize. If you look at the distribution of responses, cosine similarities to moral disgust in vermin. So this is asking questions about race, about different groups of people, and humans, as we know, can be racist. They can talk about certain groups of people as if they're vermin and they can be morally disgusted by them, but large language models are not, largely probably through the instruction tuning stage, right? They will not do it. They won't be racist, which is good if we're using them in systems, right, in resume recommendation systems, but they're very, very low variance. So I'm going to say this over and over again. One of the most consistent empirical findings we have from large language models is that there's very low variance, and humans have a lot more variance. So if we're going to try and use them in any way like we did before to audit social systems or cultural systems, to measure the way words are associated in cultural and social systems like we were able to with word embeddings, we have got to solve the variance problem. They are just far, far too homogeneous. They don't represent any sort of actual kind of cultural social space here. So why would we want to use large language models to measure social or cultural spaces? Is this even a thing that we should be doing? There is a lot of opportunities, and I know that you've had in this speaker series, probably people have talked about the opportunities of large language models in computational social science in the social world. This image here, it was not generated by me. This is a really awesome Blue Sky account that uses, I think, Midjourney, maybe Stable Diffusion, to create these really incredible images, actually. So this is a generated image, not by me, but I find them really, really gorgeous. But there are lots of opportunities for the use of large language models to study social and cultural systems. The most frequent one now, or the kind of, again, one of the more settled uses of them is for coding. And coding, I don't mean like writing Python code or R code. I mean coding in the social sciences, which is extracting bits of information from text. So we think qualitative coding, think information extraction, right? When you have a bunch of text, unstructured text, and you want to get information out of it, scholars are increasingly turning to large language models as like a coder, as an assistant. So from code books to prompt books, extracting information from text with generative large language models. So these are obituaries, and the scholar said, can we extract information from unstructured obituaries, like what was the gender, the age, the number of children, the cause of death, etc. And the large language model that they used, the 70 billion parameter Llama 3, did pretty good across many of the kind of categories. It started to fall apart a little bit with education level, which was hard for humans to extract. But if you're faced with a bunch of obituaries and you want to make sense of these obituaries by extracting information from them, you can turn to a large language model to do that. They tried different types of prompting. So of course, prompting is always a big question because prompt structures can vary the output a lot, but they varied prompting and you get pretty stable results from these obituaries, extracting information from these obituaries. So we've seen this in lots and lots of papers in the social sciences. If you want to code, as in qualitatively code, extract information from text, we might be able to use large language models in a strategic way. This was a paper that was looking at stances on Facebook and Twitter. So politicians post on Twitter and Facebook, what is their stance towards a issue, towards a policy, towards something. For Facebook in particular, the large language models did pretty good at coding stance. There's some issues there, and Che and Davis had found that fine tuning did a lot. So you can fine tune these models on certain tasks, certain questions to get them to do much better at coding text, but not substantively worse than humans is the conclusion here. Paper that I published last year with others, or I guess still 2025, but last academic year, looked at the use of large language models for kind of more complex concepts like inequality over much longer text. So full newspaper article doesn't mention economic inequality. And we found that it does just as well as supervised machine learning, but what large language models can give qualitative coders, people who want to extract information from qualitative text, is that the initial text classification can be done by large language models versus supervised machine learning, where humans have to do that initial text classification. And if you've ever done qualitative coding, it's incredibly tedious, it's incredibly time consuming, and it's not only time consuming, it's very difficult to be done in a way that you feel satisfied is done well. So if you can get large language models to do the initial text classification and then you do a whole bunch of validation steps, this really could change the fundamental way we approach qualitative data analysis. And this, of course, is text, but it's images as well. So this was a paper using a multimodal model, GPT-4, to code satellite images. But this isn't restricted to text. We can do audio, we can do images. So anytime you have a whole mess of qualitative data, text, images, audio, we can use large language models to extract information from it. If you do it carefully, if you do it validated, if you fine tune it, you can actually do it in a really valid and reliable way. Here, for these types of tasks, we actually don't want variance. This is exactly where we want reliable models that do the same thing every time. They don't have opinions. They don't have the kind of biases that come from social perspectives. We don't want them calling certain groups of people vermin. So in this case, like the lack of variability, the lack of variance is really, really helpful. So if we're using them to extract information from text, from images, is probably really good to have low variance. And so in some cases, and this is where most of social scientists has gone to, and I'm seeing this increasingly in humanities as well and cultural analytics, is use them to extract information from large bodies of cultural material. So that's great. We can do that. Low variance is good there. But what about kind of the more exciting uses of these large language models? The generative capability, right? Not just to do what we've always done, but do something genuinely new with these models. So things like counterfactuals. Manet has his Luncheon in the Garden painting, which he published. He showed in a gallery in 1863, which many claim sparked the European modern art movement, right? This was the turning point that kicked off the European modern art movement, but did it? How important was this particular image? How important was Manet? And in particular, what if that woman had been clothed, right? She was not clothed, then that was very significant. And so had she been clothed, would the European modern art movement been different? These are the questions that cultural analytics people are really interested in, thinking about how we can get some kind of empirical leverage on these big questions like genre emergence, or the way that kind of art and literary have these big cultural changes over time. Simulations, which is similar to counterfactuals here, simulations is an incredibly important method or tool for many fields, including climate science, right, which is a complex science. So if we keep the current temperature, world temperature as it is, how does this play out in 50, 60, 70 years? World temperature, if it goes up, how does this play out if it goes down, right? Climate scientists are continually simulating possible futures given the current state, given different possible scenarios in the way that climate change could happen. Social scientists now are really excited about this. So I know you had James Evans speak, so we can now simulate subjects, right? We can have them simulate text or large language models simulate text or images. We can create digital twins and have personas actually interact with one another in a complex system to see how policy changes might play out. We can have humans interact with AI systems to see how like difference in messaging might affect public health. Like, can we craft the perfect message to get people vaccinated, right? And we can use simulations to generate different possible messages. So there's lots of different ways we can use simulations. We can do this through tuning learned models, so taking pre-trained large language models and continuing to fine-tune them more. Fine-tuning has proven to be very productive in some ways. We can also steer them. I'm going to talk about steering. So we can steer them towards personas like you're a Republican, you're conservative, you're liberal, you're high income, you're low income, you're older, you're younger, right? We can try and steer these models into different parts of this high dimensional space to activate certain neurons and see how that might affect its output. So there's different methods we can use for it. And so one thing I'm interested in with colleagues who are in cultural analytics, Ted Underwood and Matt Wilkins, is to simulate the past. Can we simulate different possible histories to better understand how we got the history that we actually got, right? History only happens once. We have no idea why we can't pinpoint exactly why it happened the way that we did. We can kind of try and measure processes. But what if we could simulate 100 possible histories or 1,000 possible histories to try to understand the history that we did get? This is an automaton. We always are obsessed with robots that can do human-like things like write letters. So for example, we have opinion polls that go back, right? We know that the opinion now is flipped. Women should not return to their traditional role in society. Opinion polls only go back so far. So could we survey the past? So could we survey people who are in the past to not only understand their opinions? We certainly have the writings of people in the past, but can we understand why opinion changed? Can we try and pinpoint the effect of certain social movements or certain events or certain takes on social movements, certain arguments, certain books? Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, what was the effect of that on the environmental movement, right? We don't really know the answers to these questions, but if we could simulate different possible paths through history, we might be able to do so if we could do so accurately. So this gets me to kind of the last part of this, which is it possible to steer these methods, these models? We know from the empirical evidence thus far that these do not represent any actual perspective or social system or cultural system. They're too homogeneous. They don't have a perspective. They're not adequate right now for kind of simulating social and human and cultural systems. So can we possibly steer them? I'm not sure if I can play around with this. You can tell me if you can still see my screen. Are you able to still see my screen here?
Yes.
Okay. So this Neuronpedia is really fun to kind of play around with steering. So this is steering a feature called dogs. So can we turn up the neurons that have to do with canines, dogs, and see how it changes the output? So you can see here, I am Gemma, a large language model. Here's the kind of standard output. And then if you tune up the dogs part, you can see I am a small trained dog who loves chasing toys, right? Its answers are going to be more dog-like. So we could say something like, I need to give a present to a friend. This is going to work. It takes a bit. So this is actually pinging Gemma and using Yeah, okay, so that's fun to pick the perfect present for your friend. Tell me what kind of things. And then this says, what kind of dog is your friend? Bree, so it assumes your friend is a dog, right? Do they have any favorite things already? So it's now assuming that your friend is a dog. So you're trying to tune up the dog neurons in here. The problem is if you go high, let's like really tune up the dogs, it gets complete gibberish. They like garden. It's really, really fragile, the tuning here, if this works. It just kind of goes into a gibber, like obedience, obedience, owners, owners. It just completely falls apart. Like it doesn't produce any sort of coherent. It brings in different languages. So even in this example, right, the steering of this can get very, very fickle. It doesn't work very well. But what social scientists are trying to do with this is to steer models towards certain social vectors. So this is a paper that looked at like game theoretic situations. So like the giving game, in this scenario, would you give money to a certain thing based on this game scenario? And the idea is we could steer the model to like be a 40-year-old's persona versus a 20-year-old, and then we could isolate the effect of that tuning on the decision on like how much money would you transfer in this game theory. And so we could try to say simulate different scenarios. You could do a gender vector, right? You can try and steer these vectors and then measure the effect of steering the vector on the output. So if we could accurately steer these towards certain personas, there's actually a huge amount we could do. They're just very, very fickle and hard to steer here. And so rather than steering, back to Ted Underwood and Matt Wilkins and I trained our own GPT-2 size model on text that only went up to 1914. So we now have a model that we know has only seen text up to 1914. We don't need to steer it. We know that it only knows anything up until 1914. And then we can prompt it with some questions. Continue this passage in the same style for at least 200 words. We give it a passage from pre-1914 era. It kind of generates output, and then we can measure the stylistic center of mass. So train a Roberta model to say what year was this text likely created, and GPT 1914, which has not seen anything past 1914, kind of mimics the ground truth in terms of generating accurate style. We can see GPT-4 and 3.5 are contemporary. They sound like something written in 2000. But if you fine tune GPT-4, you can fine tune it to sound like somebody from 1914. So we could potentially fine tune a large language model to accurately mimic the style of somebody in 1910, 1914 without having to train your own model, right? But it's not just about style, it's about facts and anachronisms. So we also prompted these models. This is not the 1914 model. This is GPT, a fine-tuned GPT-4o model and a ground truth model. Ground truth meaning actual text from the period. So prompt the model, describe the skyscrapers and other notable sites of Fifth Avenue in New York City, and you get the actual ground truth and you get the modeled output. So if you read these two outputs, they stylistically probably sound similar. And in fact, when we measure it, they are. But what we get are problems like the New York Life building was constructed in 1928. It should not be in a model that's prompted to be somebody in 1914. So we get anachronisms slipping in. You should not have a New York Life building. Now, identifying these anachronisms is incredibly difficult. How did the Ku Klux Klan begin? These are two largely correct, factually correct statements from a ground truth and the model, but we have the model slip in African Americans. This phrase was not coined until the 1960s. It should not occur in a passage if you're trying to accurately simulate a human subject, would not ever use the phrase African American in 1914. So these anachronisms slip in. They're very hard to identify. They largely come from the instruction tuning on these models and the kind of recency bias of these models. So if we're going to simulate the past, which I think is a very protective path for these models, we would have to validate not only style, which we can largely get models to reproduce style, but anachronisms as well. We cannot have them know something that they shouldn't know if we're trying to simulate the past. There's potentially no ground truth here or multiple ground truths. So again, human people in history have very different opinions, very different views on things. There's not just one single ground truth. So how do you validate these models? And specifically, how do you build a benchmark where there are no multiple ground truths? So how do we benchmark historical simulations, which is a huge question. How do we make sure it's not kind of simulating the wrong thing and we're building any sort of kind of reality on these methods here? And so I'll just end and then see if anybody here has thoughts on any of this, why I think we're talking about the wrong error in large language models. So we have static word embeddings. I've kind of skipped over the encoder only models, BERT and such, which I would love to talk about as well. Skipped over to large language models, specifically the decoder only large language models, generative large language models, GPT, llama, etc. And then thinking about the future with embeddings, they're perspectival. At least you can train them to be perspectival. You can train them to be situationable. You can manipulate them in a pretty reliable way. You can use vector addition, subtraction. And the way social scientists and some cultural analytics people have been using them is to reveal social bias, right? Audit these social and cultural systems to measure the associations between words. And we know it can do that because of the philosophy of language and how that develops. Large language models are not this. They're amalgams. They smash this together in a way that is potentially very, very powerful, but also potentially very unhelpful if we're using them the way that we've been using them for the past 10 years, using these methods for the past 10 years. They create this kind of universal human that cannot ever exist. That's a different thing that we've been dealing with than previous methods. It's like the Titanic. It's actually very, very hard to steer these in any direction, and people are trying, and we are continuing to try to be able to steer them into the sections of these very high dimensional spaces that we want to steer them into. And the kind of empirical implication or the empirical finding from this is they are far, far, far too homogeneous and not in a way that's helpful to understand any kind of social or cultural system. They obliterate the heterogeneity that we want to understand when we understand kind of meaning in text and associations in text and images and audio, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So generative AI gives us capabilities that we didn't have in the past with kind of decoder only models or static word embeddings. We can produce counterfactuals, generate counterfactuals. We can do simulations, kind of intelligent, complex simulations that we haven't been able to do. It requires us, though, to be able to steer them in reliable ways and benchmark them, which has so far been very difficult to do. And specifically, they are far, far too homogeneous. Variance matters. We have got to figure out how to bring back kind of the human variance into these models in a way that they haven't had thus far, at least empirically, what people have found thus far. Great. That is what I have. I'm
Super.
very open
Thank
to
you very much. This is great. Yes. Let me do the same thing here.
And because it is early, I'm
just so sort of everybody is visible. Yeah, this was super exciting. You tickled a lot of things, I think, not only for me, but for other people too. Because bias and variance are two things which, if you deal long enough with cultural data, as an art historian, as a social scientist, whatever, you encounter both. And indeed, the bias question sort of is tedious often because all data is biased.
Yeah, exactly.
The variance question is typically overlooked. Like in my PhD, I found fat tails of frequency of objects being depicted, but then there's another fat tail, which is the variance of the depiction of the respective object, which is a completely different tail, which is sort of like, you know, they're sort of like, they're not in parallel. And that is a really interesting thing, but people don't talk about it because the word variance is not openly discussed a lot. And you've given a lot of examples, I think, why we should do. I see Mike has lifted his hand. So anybody else, please sort of like just lift, if you're online, lift your hand. And if you're locally, there is Mark Metz who has lifted his hand. So we go one after the other. We've got quite some time, I think. And then, okay, so there's William. So let's start with Mike and then Mark and then William.
Okay, can you hear me?
I give the mic to Mike.
Yeah, I can hear you. Oh,
Okay,
Oh, Mike's
thank
in the
you.
room. Oh,
Thank you.
okay.
It was, as Max said, really interesting, and I think you have a very good point. Generally, however, I have several, well, maybe a couple of comments and then one question. One comment, I don't know, I've met it just recently and I checked it and it seems to work. Speaking of this low variance thing, that if you ask essentially any large language model to name a random number between 1 and 10, it always answers 7.
7, yep.
Yeah, so like 90+% of time. So it is sort of a minor illustration of what you were talking about, but I think it might say that it is something inside the model itself. So when we are thinking of social things, we can expect that it is sort of steered by additional prompts towards some sort of answer. But I don't think that anybody would have prompted it to answer this particular random number. So it is probably in the base model itself that it is sort of does things more less random than people actually do. And then also the comment concerning steering. What came to my mind basically is that even if we are good at steering the model, the problem which we are talking about still exists. Because if you, even if we can make the model speak like, I don't know, 48-year-old adult white male, for example, or I don't know, 20-year-old black woman or whatever, it will not speak as a representative as basically as you should, but as just an average of this group, and just summing over the averages, you end up sort of in a little bit in a situation is what, even if you are steering it and making it sort of representative sample of groups, it will not be how actual society looks like. And then I have a couple of questions concerning your very first part about the sort of biases in word embedding thing, and maybe can
just on the first part, and then we get to the second. I think it is an empirical question whether it's the base model or the instruction tuning, and it's very much measurable, right? Because we have access for many of the models, we have access to both. We have access to the base model and the instruction tune model. So there's computer scientists are looking at that exact thing of like, where in the process do these different behaviors, dynamics, processes come from? And so it's something we should be asking, right? I'm guessing somebody has asked that with the random number thing. Is it there in the base model? Because that's just a sequence that would be very easy to prompt a base model versus an instruction tune. But these are all empirical questions, right? Which I actually think, I actually think we as in the social science, cultural humanities, cultural analytics world should be doing much more with the base models. We tend to go straight to the instruction tune models, which I think is the wrong instinct. I do it myself. I think that's the wrong instinct. I think we should be going to the base models for almost everything that we're doing. The exceptions are like, do we want to understand how humans are interacting with the systems? And because humans are interacting with the instruction tune systems, we would want to do that. But for any sort of analytical purposes, we should be going to the base model. And there we might be able to get more variance out of that. I really do think so.
Brilliant.
But yeah, so the word embeddings.
Sorry, second part. Sorry.
So can we get back to your presentation, to the sort of cross-sectional part about 19th century South with
Yeah.
For example, or maybe the next picture was concerning power, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, authority.
Yeah.
What I see, well, let me frame this, my question is the following way. What I see here is that white men and black men essentially are the same in terms of whatever authority is.
Yeah, that's right.
And
Yes.
number one, it at least from whatever I know about 19th century United States, it seems wrong to me.
Yes, that's right. Exactly. Yep.
And so basically the question, my question is number one, why is it so and how authority defined? And more generally, how you can convince, for example, a skeptic like me that what you get here is actually relevant.
Yeah. No, that's right.
That I should take this thing seriously. It is a sort of meta question in terms of well, how you convince a person to believe what you do, that this is that things you get from this method are not artifacts. Are there benchmarks when you can sort of convincingly prove that it is doing something relevant?
Yeah, there's no benchmarks because it's its own trained model, but that's why you go through this exercise where it is kind of, all right, so women are more domestic, right? Men are associated with polity. So you go through the things here where you validate on stuff that should be known or more relevant. And there's other validation things in the paper itself. So before you get to the one where you're like, wow, this is weird and feels wrong, it's a genuine puzzle, right? Because scholars have debated whether the gender scheme or the racial schema in this century is more influential, right? This is a genuine debate among historians. And we're talking about discursive authority. We're not talking about actual authority, right? So, for example, to put down slave rebellions or the idea of slave rebellions, one of the theories that historians have said is that Black men were given actual like authority over Black women. They kind of hyped up gender differences among slave populations, kind of overemphasizing gender differences in order to lessen the kind of desire for rebellions, specifically among Black men. So Black men were given kind of higher authority in the home in enslaved communities over Black women in various ways, and slavers did this in various ways, so kind of hyped up gender differences. And it also lessened the sting of like white women having actual authority over Black men, right? It was very emasculating in some ways there. And so there is like one of the theories is that you play up these kind of gender differences within enslaved communities in order to quell slave rebellions. And that's going to come through in the narratives of the time, the first person narratives of the time. And so we're talking about discursive authority, not real authority. And it does, at least if you trust anything about these methods, right? And you can go through other validation things, it does suggest that discursively in the language that people were using, Black men were afforded discursive authority.
What is discursive authority exactly?
Power.
What seems, as we discussed, what seems wrong here is not the fact that Black men have a lot of authority over Black women. That is definitely true, and well, you just described a very good argument for that. It is that Black men have exactly the same level of authority that as white men have.
Discursive,
which seems, well, at least discursively, which seems, I mean, in a society where, well, we know what sort of, I don't know what your data set is it's antebellum or after the war, but anyway, the level of authority of white men over Black men at this stage is incredible.
Yeah, it's not, and this is not over white woman. This is a cosine similarity between the Black men vector and the authority vector and the white woman vector and the authority vector. So as soon as you include women in the vector, and as soon as you include men in the vector, it pulls it towards the authority vector, and the modification of adding the race there, Black, which was generated by adding like Negro, colored, some other vectors together, right? If that doesn't modify, that does not attenuate the cosine similarity to the authority vector for either white or black, but it does for other vectors. And the authority vector is just literally the word authority, right? That's it. So there, race does not attenuate that discursive cosine similarity between the authority vector and the men vector. So men are close to the authority vector, women are not. We can't attenuate that using race the way we could with some of the other ones. Like you can attenuate some of the relationships using race, but it did not work with authority, with the very simple vectorization of the word authority, right? That's it. And so
at least I understand the statement now. Thank you so much.
Yeah. But it doesn't feel right. And I actually didn't lean too much in this finding because it is just vectors, right, that we're playing with. But it is also quite interesting to me that you weren't able to attenuate the cosine similarity with race in the way you were with other kind of vectors for authority in particular.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Like before we go to William, if it's not on the exact same subject, I would like to extend the question a little bit.
I have also.
Yeah, and Mark was first. Okay. So, Laura, there is a sort of like really interesting thing going on, which is intersectional theory, was sort of like introduced by somebody very smart, and in a sort of like qualitative manner. And in the wake of that very smart Kimberly Crenshaw, who also was the person who sort of like almost saved us from Clarence Thomas, but he didn't. So basically, in the wake of that, I think another author whose name I have not in my head right now talked about the intersectional matrix. And if one reads that, one just feels so tempted to actually draw that matrix.
Yes.
Right? And so nobody ever does. But one of the key things is, now as we look at this kind of thing, this looks a lot like semantic differential in Osgood, Suchi, and Tenenbaum, where you have these sort of like opposites, like love and hate and, you know, stuff like that. And then you have these sort of faders. And one of the interesting things about Osgood, Suchi, and Tenenbaum, it's like an incredibly misogynistic shit show of like how the figures are constructed. And so one of the key issues is, do you think we could make an advance in this kind of literature by actually taking sort of like Crenshaw and followers seriously, actually making a confusion matrix and not the semantic differentials, which would allow us to look at the multidimensionality of these concepts and not as being like poles on one side or the other?
Yep. Exactly. That's exactly what we can do now. Our visualizations are 2D. So as soon as we try to visualize this stuff, we get kind of bogged down into the paper, but we don't need to do anymore. We can have like 3D and more visualizations, right? In computer systems when we don't have the journal as the kind of standard. But yes, that's exactly what we should be doing, right? Ben Schmidt wrote that Breaking the Gender Binary way a long time ago with word embeddings to do exactly that. We don't need to treat these as polars anymore, right? Which we do in like survey data. That's exactly why these, I would claim, these are feminist methods, precisely for that reason. Now, when we force ourselves into the journal publication, we flatten it out and it sucks. I have some scatter plots in this paper where I tried to capture the multidimensionality of it, but it's very hard to do in a journal format. But 100% what we should be doing, right? Don't treat these as binaries. Don't treat these as which is still what we're doing, unfortunately, but we don't have to. And I think that's incredibly exciting and what I hope cultural analytics people who are more creative can do.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that.
Okay, Mark, I need to, I'm really lousy with my camera here. Okay, no, I'm actually good today. Okay, yes. Mark Metz.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It was really interesting. I have several questions. I would jump. Other one I will leave for later, maybe if there's time. I would like to discuss more of this method, actually, of this static, looking at the static embeddings, and it's been around for a while, right? This cultural cartography, or like different ways it's been called as well. So maybe the first part of the question I wanted to ask: what's the current state of using that method from your experience? That is it used, or like this sort of static model still trained, and is it usually like this? Does it mean like word-to-vec models, and does it mean that using our own pre-constructed vocabularies then to find the dimensions? And maybe if you could relate to that also, that have actually the generative language models somehow still contributed.
I think for most people, static embeddings have been eclipsed by dynamic embeddings because they more accurately represent the actual discourse. And then you can do contextualized embeddings, right? So you can say, so in the intersectional example that I gave, right, I'm just using vector addition and subtraction to try to isolate different parts of the vectors. So you can think riverbank versus financial bank. We can isolate the financial bank vector by subtracting out the river vector from the bank vector. But we can now do that dynamic contextually, right? We can have a different vector for the financial bank and we have a different vector for the river bank. So we actually just have two vectors now rather than kind of doing vector addition and subtraction. So it's a much richer and much more accurate using dynamic embeddings, which can look forward and backward, and using contextualized embeddings, which means we can have a different vector for the word in the way it's used in different contexts, is a much more rich way of representing these. And so people have largely moved away from static embeddings for that reason. Right? They were needed at the time. They were computationally tractable. That was what we had in 2014 and 2015 and 2016, but no longer do we need to be constrained to static embeddings. And so if we think about decoder only models like BERT and creating dynamic embeddings, contextualized embeddings, those have increased the accuracy. If we're just talking about accuracy of like text classification or representing concepts in text, they are much, much, much more accurate than the static embeddings. So why not use them, right? What is the reason to go back to static embeddings when we have this much more accurate, if you have the computational power? Now, the reasons to use static embeddings is because you have very little data, and you have a very specific question on a small amount of data, or you just don't have computational power to use kind of the dynamic contextualized embeddings. But you will lose out on accuracy there. But what you gain is control and specificity, right? If you're training your own model and you're not using pre-trained models from like BERT to make your contextualized embeddings, you are now know that you are constrained to the data you're interested in. And that can be very powerful, right? If you're saying, I want to know within this corpus, image or text corpus, I want to know what the dynamics are there. And I don't want any bleeding from pre-trained methods from like, there's fast text, which is a static embedding that is a large model, but that bleeds into your model, right? That bleeds into your corpus. And so if you want to be very sure that you're only modeling the dynamics within your very specific corpus, and it's not a very large corpus, static embeddings are probably the best way to go because they offer that control. They offer the knowledge that you're only looking at that specific context. Now, if you're doing like an English language corpus and you want the power of like, there's just a lot of information conveyed in the English language that has nothing to do with your specific dynamics. It's just language has properties. That's what we get from the pre-trained stuff. That's what we get from the contextual embeddings, is a lot of the information that is not important to understanding our particular corpus, but we want that information there because it kind of just makes sense of language, which has its own properties, so that we can get to the dynamics that we want to get to in a more accurate way. And that's where you would bring in pre-trained BERT models. You get legal BERT. You have all these fine-tuned BERTs that you can use to do that. Your accuracy will go way, way up. You will lose a little bit of control over what you're modeling, and you're going to get some bleeding in from the pre-trained models, and so you have to account for that. And sometimes you want that, right? Because English is English, and you don't care. You just want to model English so that you can get to the dynamics that you want. But I think for the most part, I'm seeing very little static embeddings, except for like small corpuses that you really want to dig deep into, which I love those studies. So I want to see more of those. But people are more often going to these contextual embeddings because they more accurately represent language, and they are just like legions more accurate for most of the tasks that social scientists want to do.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that makes perfect sense, actually.
But I actually really like training like the ability to train our own models and just have so much control over it.
Yeah. Maybe actually the other part of the question. So when using the static models or constructing, maybe to start from that, if you construct the vocabulary for it. So so the examples of what we were discussing regards the last question, right? So the last few that for example, the authority and so the dimension of authority itself, right? You said it was already defined based on certain keywords. So one question is that, is there a better way maybe to find this keyword or to have your best practice? And maybe the more tentative question for me that, but what are actually the biases in there that we don't know about? What are the dimensions in it that we want to find, but we don't know how to ask for it? So has there been any work actually on that to find these diagonals, the dimensions that we cannot actually think we want to, which ones are those actually? So
yeah, it's a huge question and kind of problematic, I think, because there's been a lot of research to show that like rare words have their own dynamic versus frequent words that have nothing to do with like actual word associations. It's just simply to do with they occur less frequently than high frequency words. And so you get all these dynamics in word embeddings that are just an artifact of words and language and not the associations that we typically want to capture. So we have to be really careful. And that probably was happening in the corpus I was using because it was small. There was probably rare words that was driving some of the dynamics. Could be authority, right? So it's really, really tricky there. And so some of the strategies, although people have moved on, so there hasn't been as much research here, but some of the strategies are to use averaging. So you come up with a lot of different words that indicate a concept and you average over them. That's one way to try and prevent some of the sensitivity to that. I did just see a paper from Marshall Taylor coming out. I don't know if it's out or I saw an ad for a talk on it, which I'm going to look at, which looks like it is specifically about how to kind of do constructs in static word embeddings. That's just a prompt to go look for that. I haven't seen it. I haven't read it, but it looks like he's still working on this. And it looked kind of interesting about how to identify kind of concepts reliably in static word embeddings. So I'm going to go check that out soon. And then for like emergent concepts, what's in there that we may not be thinking of? Clustering, right? You can cluster vectors, similar to topic models, but you can look at how they cluster together, which may emerge, may allow concepts to emerge from the data that you're not kind of forcing into the model. And so Marshall Taylor does that as well, and Dustin Stoltz. He looks at clustering of vectors to identify kind of latent concepts that you may not be thinking of, or not latent, but it's just ones that you haven't been thinking of. Yeah, so clustering of vectors can be very powerful.
Thank you. Yeah.
Nice. Thank you very much. William.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. That was super interesting. Yeah, I wanted to ask how or if you see your work and research crossing over with RAG-based systems. So for those in the room who maybe know of these but don't have a name for them, these are systems like, for example, the recent Google LM, where from the user side, you have this model, but the user can input their own documents. And while this isn't fine-tuning in the way that we are talking about it, it's been for me like the closest thing where a everyday user can manipulate the behavior of a language-based system. So maybe just to put that more into a question, do you see your work or any kind of solutions where such systems could facilitate this this tuning process?
Yes, I think I was kind of down on RAG is retrieval augmented generation. So you use a large language model and you put kind of a penultimate layer, which is your own corpus. And then when you ask it questions, it gets filtered through your corpus. So it draws on those draws on those weights before it goes to the kind of the base weights. So it manipulates the weights for the next word prediction to overemphasize what's in your corpus that you have fed it. So like if you're a professor and you feed it your course material, ideally when your students use a RAG that's based on your course material, they're going to first see stuff from your material before they see just the general slop that's on the internet. So yes, I think that RAG, fine-tuning, steering, and then prompting, actually, the recent research that comes out is showing that prompting is actually in context learning. It actually changes the weight. So really clever prompting. I think those 4 ways are the ways we can steer it. I have no idea which way is better. We need a benchmark. Like, we can test it, right? But how do we know that RAG is better than fine tuning? That's better than steering. That's better than prompting. If we don't have a benchmark, we are just shooting darts at this point. We're shooting darts at a no target. What's the right metaphor? I don't know what the right metaphor is. We have no way of knowing if we can build a RAG and it will do this output, and we can fine tune and it will do this output. Which one is better? Right. So we have to have a way to validate the output, and a way that validates it in a way that we can play around with these. But I think RAG should be one of the kind of 4 things that we play with: RAG, fine tuning, steering, and prompting.
I'm writing it down. That's really nice. I think that leads to a follow-up question that's related is so yeah, the system that I've been asked to help on, it's for academics, right? And my proposal was, compared to everyday users, academics would want to maybe see some of the things behind the hood.
Yes.
Even if they're using it just as a, to ask questions about their research. So to formulate a question, what do you think would be, if you had a version of Notebook LM or GPT that you could expose some of either the graphs you already have or something else that shows some sort of statistical things? What do you think would be an effective thing you could show, whether it's graphic or some statistics that would show what the mechanics are that might expose some of the bias, so a user could be, okay, that's the answer the machine gave me, but I can revalidate that based on the extra information that is there.
Yeah. I don't know the average academic what they would want to see, which is very different than like people in this room who have more of an understanding of these models. But what I would want to see is, so we get next word prediction, right? We just get the sentence and the paragraphs out, but it's actually a probability distribution on the back end, right? It's here's the probability distribution of the words that could be the next word. And it pulls from that probability distribution, and it depends on the temperature, and it depends on the top K, right? That's determining where from the probability distribution the model is pulling from to build the next word prediction. So rather than giving me a deterministic output, because it's not, it's probabilistic, give me the probabilities, right? And show me the top 20 probabilities, and then show how when I change the top K, or I change temperature, or the kind of simple things, but if I even did a RAG, right, how would it change the probability? Now you can look at all the different layers and try and like trace the neural path through the different layers. That gets like so overwhelming, it doesn't make any sense. But what's very meaningful to me is to actually see how the probability distribution changes, and then how it's pulling from the probability distribution to give you that deterministic word. That to me is like really, really powerful. And there are some websites that I've seen that do that, and it makes it so much clearer what's happening, and it doesn't feel like this anthropomorphized, like deterministic thing on the thing. And you can very, very quickly see how it's memorizing form and not facts when it does that. And that's very powerful. So that's what I would want to see. But I am not an average academic in terms of like people who are now coming around to thinking about the use of language models.
Okay, that answers perfectly. Thank you so much.
I can send you a website that I love if I can play around and
I would
find.
totally, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, the next question is from Anders Karius, who's online.
Yeah, hi again. Right, so since you mentioned benchmarking again, I actually kind of wanted to ask about this anyway, because towards the end of the talk you mentioned it, you described it as something immensely difficult, but I actually didn't. I'm not sure I actually understood why. Why do you see benchmarking as such a difficult exercise, especially for us? I mean, for computer scientists, yeah, sure, maybe, because they don't necessarily work with culture and language and societies. But for us as humanities and culture and social scientists, we should be good at creating benchmarks. So why do you see this as a very difficult exercise?
We should be good at creating benchmarks. All right, so how would you create a benchmark that would convince me that a model is simulating or is accurately representing 1910 United States? Like, what is the benchmark you would use?
If that's not a rhetorical question, is probably
not a rhetorical question.
Benchmarks are created right now for various small languages. This is a thing that is actually happening here in Estonia as well. People are trying to create not just language benchmarks, but also culture benchmarks to evaluate which language models are, best work best for our culture or language. Especially now in Estonia, there's this whole AI leap kind of thing going on where they try to introduce AI in schools, and of course you need models that understand the culture and history and so on. Which is basically benchmarks consist of just a bunch of questions. Just the same way you would interrogate a human, you interrogate the language model.
Like what questions though to capture culture? This is a very open question in the computer science world, cultural alignment, right? We often use country as a stand-in for culture, which is terrible. We often use etiquette as a stand-in for culture. So like, what do you bring to a dinner party, right? What do you bring to a 16-year-old birthday party? And it shouldn't be wine to a 16-year-old's birthday party, but it maybe should for a dinner party, but not in a Muslim country, right? You wouldn't bring wine. So, but what are the questions? This is not rhetorical, like genuinely.
No, well,
how do you capture culture?
What you just very, very much exemplified. A bunch of these culture-specific questions or historical perspective about historical events, like what happened in 1939, so things like that that give you an idea. It's the same way you would benchmark for bias. If you ask a model, something about lawyers and doctors and nurses and men and women, you get some idea. If you do this over and over again, you get some idea if the model is biased in saying that all the lawyers are men or something.
Yeah. Right. So if we're gonna simulate, or if we're gonna try and accurately represent history in the United States, you want the model to be racist, right? But how racist do you want it to be, and how do you know it's racist enough?
Yeah. So
and in what dimensions is it racist enough, right?
Yeah. So you basically want the racism benchmark, and probably if you want for the model to behave in a way, and if just adding a system prompt like please be a racist is not enough, then you probably need to fine tune it the same way that they use reinforcement learning to get these instruction models to work, right?
Exactly. So, exactly right. But how do you measure whether it's racist enough, and over what dimensions is it racist enough?
But
right?
wouldn't the same approach work, where you just ask it a bunch of different, the same thing that social scientists do day in, day out, they interview and do surveys, right? So ask from various angles something about, do you think a black man should be able to own a horse or drive an automobile or own land or something, and then that the aggregation of these questions, and again probably iterated numerous times, you get some idea of like a racism score, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. So just where does that data come from, right? Opinion surveys only go back so far. They only survey certain people. And then, of course, there's not only one ground truth, right? So if you are a black man, you're going to have different opinions than a white man. And so what are you benchmarking there? And so do you have like, all right, here's the opinion of this demographic group, which is not exactly right because there's a variation over each demographic group. And so, and where does the data come from? How far back does it go? Is it country specific? Is it city specific? And so there's a whole bunch of questions like that. So maybe there are great opinion surveys. How do you benchmark multiple perspectives, right? And so I think we can do it. I don't think it's impossible.
So it's not impossible. Yeah, that's kind of my question, because
it's not impossible.
Like it's just a lot of work. You need to work with historians.
That's 100%.
Get historians to build you some of these informative questions, and
that's right.
Yeah,
it's not impossible.
Okay, it just takes work. Well, I mean, research is hard.
100%.
If it would be easy, then it would be boring.
Yes. I guess my pitch is more historians should be doing this work to create genuinely to create benchmarks. And a lot of historians don't want to because they don't want to get AI to be more historically accurate, which is fair. But yes, it's going to take interdisciplinarity. It's going to take people who understand the history, who have a bit more of a sophisticated understanding of culture that's not like, what do you bring to a party, right? Culture is not that. Culture is not a set of facts, right? Culture is a way of understanding the world, its schemas.
Yeah.
We can capture that, right, in text. We've been doing that for decades, so we can absolutely do it. It's not easy. The data gets harder the further back you go in history, right? Because it's not digitized. It's hard to OCR it. Technology is better now. We can maybe do some of that. It's also selective. We're not capturing the whole population, but historians have been dealing with that for decades. We know how to deal with that. So yes, let's do it. We can do it, and let's do it. I actually appreciate your optimism now. Yes.
I happen to work with historians in some projects, and you have people who are specializing in specific countries, cultures, time periods.
Yes.
So this, I feel like there's a huge opportunity to just
Yes.
draw on this expertise from humanities, or whatever you want to call their disciplines,
Yes.
which could be useful in these more technical fields.
Yes. Yes, and we build up different expertise from different cultures and different histories and build up these benchmarks. Yes, 100%.
But you're absolutely right. Yes, some people in social science. So I am also now part of a social science department in a different university, and yes, some people hate AI, so they are a little bit difficult to bring on board.
Yeah, and we're asking to build a racist bot. Like, that's not going to land nicely with people for good reason, right?
Anyway, thanks.
Thank you very much. I have a bunch of questions too. And so I like, there's three aspects which I really love about your talk. One was the final summary, which is a really cool basis for discussion. The other thing is the material science sort of like comparison of the amalgam. And then one other thing is this issue of anachronisms, which I think is a really interesting one. Let me start with this one. Like one thing I learned in art history I sort of trained myself as a large language model, not a large language model, as a sort of like convolutional neural network, recognizing particular ruins in Rome on drawings, which can have common many, many different styles. And literally, I did this for several years, like looking at sort of like tens of thousands of these drawings. And one of the things I learned is that a lot of the anachronisms you can't see if you learn categories. Like you have to just look at a lot of material, and at some point stuff falls into place, and often it takes very long time for stuff falling into place. And then you see anachronisms. In the same way, there's a simple example. In the late 19th century, there were a lot of like fake terracotta figurines, like drapery pictures, which people paid insane amount of money for. And then 100 years later, everybody recognized they're fake. In the same way, people ran out of the cinema when they saw the Nibelungen movie of Fritz Lang, and now everybody's sort of, again, it's a VW bully boss with dressed up as a dragon. Like, you won't be scared. So that kind of stuff is sort of something which I think we're sort of hopelessly caught in this thing that there will be a lot of things and all the interesting stuff that you just cannot see by your trained model. So in some sense, you need to sort of find a way to spot and recognize things that your model is explicitly not trained on. So the question is how to do that systematically.
I want you to tell me the answer, because with the model that we trained, well, not the model we trained, with the fine-tuned models we were testing, Matt, Ted, and I. So Matt is a literary scholar, historian. We all study kind of the same period. So we had these prompts that were pulled from the 1911 version of the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? How did the Ku Klux Klan begin? Whatever. We had model output. So we had to go through and say, does this output contain any anachronisms? And let me tell you, 3 professors who are Googling, like, when was the New York Life building constructed? It was tedious. It was really hard. And Matt and I agreed on a lot, actually, but Ted did not agree with us on some of them. So even 3 experts we couldn't agree on. At a super high rate. And it was just tedious. The biggest thing, it was just tedious, right? We're searching every little phrase, and then questions of like, is it sufficiently, is it too multicultural, right? Is it too accepting of different cultures? Okay, where's the line there, right? Like, so we asked it questions about certain villages in Russia that the answer was like, this is a multicultural haven. And it's like, no, you wouldn't, nobody in 1910 would say that, but how do you make that decision? We decided very quickly that was not the way to go. Like, we didn't publish the paper. We posted the paper on arXiv and said, this is crazy. This is no way of benchmarking because it was hours and hours of work. And even then it was hard. So yeah, how do you benchmark that? Anachronisms. How do you identify anachronisms? That's our current challenge. And I have zero solution to that.
Nice.
Like you
I
can
think we should-
identify like African American, right? Shouldn't exist. That wasn't coined until the 1960s. So you can do some sort of, you can think about like bigram matching and matching it to Google Books or something. But even that is like tedious and not clear that it would work correctly. So yeah,
Yeah, let's leave it open for the community. So the second aspect, this material science thing. So I love that you use that, and not just like saying it, but you actually sort of brought an example. So I have a sort of hobby horse, which is like a fascination for confusion. And one of the interesting things that actually I wrote a 3-page piece about this in 2018. Unfortunately, it's in the John Brockman book, which should never be cited again due to circumstances. The key thing is that you have confusion matrices, and what computer scientists do, they diagonalize them. So they want to get rid of type 1 and type 2 errors, while in reality, the stuff off the diagonal is obviously the interesting part, right? So stuff that is not falling into buckets, but in reality looks different, is much more interesting. And one example I bring there is that if you look at material science and look at confusion there, you find that in glasses, for example, impurities make the glass stronger. And actually, if you look at your cell phone, that Gorilla Glass in front is actually a medieval glass recipe with some impurities, which was found. It was not sort of like designed, because it's really, really hard to come up with this. You can literally just try out and like find. And so the key question is, taking you seriously on this material science sort of like notion, do you think that we can build better amalgams, better large language models that have these kind of impurities where they sort of like don't fall into the sort of like, sort of most convenient local minimum and always give you the same result, but basically sort of like give you a variance of output because there is sort of like some kind of stones they hurt their knee on, basically.
Yeah. I think that's what we should be doing is kind of forcing the absurdity, forcing the uncanny valley in a way, and which is what a lot of artists are doing, right? They're forcing these models to the absolute bizarrest edge you could force them to. Artists really liked GANs because they were just so absurd and weird and like didn't make any sense, and that was very exciting. But then large language models, you get this AI slop that is just like uninteresting, right? So can we push it back out into the uncanny, into the like random areas? Now, does that come through? What's interesting about your comment is that just going to happen because we train it in this weird way, or it just like we find it and we're like, wow, this model produces variance, right? This model does push us out. Or do we need to be more purposeful at it? From your Gorilla Glass example, it's like, no, there's no way to engineer that. We just found it, or whatever the material scientists found it as a medieval recipe. But can we purposely do this, or do we just need to like be thinking about different ways of training or different material and see if it emerges? I'm not sure what the answer is, but that's what we should be doing, right?
I think the important lesson here is like they take old glass shards and recipes and do them and put them in a spectrometer, which and that actually puts me to the last question here, or the last sort of like trying to nurture more discussion around this point. So this notion of observation versus sort of like research design. And so this is sort of a shameless plug for our lecture series, for our seminar series here. A couple of weeks back, we had Myung Cha, who has a very similar stance that I have, which is sort of like saying to myself, shut up and observe, like don't model, don't benchmark, but actually just look at what can you really see. And she does the same thing with satellite pictures, for example. This is kind of like, counting yurts in Mongolia, for example, is like a really simple problem, but actually you need to just get better in the observation part. And so one of the interesting things, if you look at your summary, there's a rather qualitative difference between the 3 columns, right? So in your LLM, that's sort of like the weakness part. You could say the amalgams, the universal, the homogeneous, and actually have a question of what do you mean with the Titanic? But we all see that there's a weakness part. And then there is these 2 sort of like more utopic things where on the one hand, you have this sort of like cool thing of the embeddings, where they're perspectival, they're situational, they're manipulable, they reveal social bias, and all of this is formal, right? Like if one can measure, we can actually sort of like, use our hands, and there's a lot of like in the background geometry, if you think about what situational means and what perspective means and stuff like that. So that is all super cool and super attractive for me to do. But then on the other hand, if I read your future, that reminds me a lot of sort of like the status of complexity science in the early 2000s, where if you wanted to get funding, you had to simulate and write a mathematical model. If you were a humanist and you applied for humanistic funding, it's about term definition and stuff like that. So one of the interesting things, like it seems like observation goes out the door and we all go for causality. And one of the interesting things, if you just take these things word by word of the future, and that goes to this question, like counterfactuals. Okay, so the embeddings actually have no facts. They're just assertions about facts, right? So there is no facts. So how can you have a counterfactual to a non-fact? Like this Manet thing being the first, like, I don't know who said that, it was probably a middle-aged guy, but that's probably not how modernity started, right? The same simulation, like there's this thing, oh, okay, so you need to sort of like be similar to something, which in climate models means the real world. But again, we only have assertions about facts. We have no real world in our data. There's a lot of stuff missing, like following Umberto Eco, we're like, yeah, it's mostly gap and very little text, basically. And then steering, that it gets worse, right? Like steering means control. So do we have a control theory? That also means like sort of like, they're already, you're fully in the causality realm. And then obviously benchmark, you want to have some kind of baseline. But again, if you only have assertions about facts, there's literally no ground in semantic space, even though the gravity law may hold. So how do we deal with that? Like, can we at least have a niche for a bunch of people who do observe, and then just say, this is like the shape of this data set, this is the shape of that data set, and then sort of like have some kind of like reference points, which are always the same, which to me, it seems the large companies are actually doing. Like the fact that OpenAI recently hired a chief content officer means they now increasingly understand that it's not about the model and the architecture, it's about the actual data that they put in.
Yep. Yeah. Yes. I mean, I don't see these as mutually exclusive, interestingly, like observing and measuring. But we saw that with Anthropic, right? The picture I had of the Golden Gate Bridge was Golden Gate Claude, where they steered Anthropic to only talk about the Golden Gate Bridge. And in doing so, they kind of mapped out the kind of internal space of it. It was really just a descriptive exercise to like think about how neurons fire and including the training data, right? So Anthropic does a lot of this stuff. It requires open weights, and not only open weights, like we need to know what's in the data, and we don't often do that. Even with the open source models, we don't know what the data is. We know what the weights are, but we don't necessarily know what the data are. And there's like, all the copyright lawsuits being thrown around. People don't want to reveal what's in their models. But you also get the phi class of models, which are very small. You get the kind of scholarly models, which are very specific, only scientific literature in it, right? So we have this happening all over the place. You have the Plius models that are very clear about like using only out of copyright data. That doesn't mean anything about the content, but it's like very clear about what the data is going into. So this is what we're seeing, right? We're seeing lots of companies play around with, do we need to go smaller? Is better data better? Scaling laws, right? We can't just continue to scale up forever. We literally run out of data. And so we go smaller, we go thing. And this is what's happening. So what do we do with that? Do we just observe it, describe what's happening? Then what? But I don't see those as mutually exclusive. I think this is exactly what we should be doing. But at some point, right, you don't want to just read tea leaves, and you don't want to get lost in the models themselves, and you're just doing an exploration of like, and then of course we have the instruction tuning. There's just so much complexity to it, right? So do we only deal with base models? What is the instruction tuning layer doing? What are the guardrails, right? We can't release racist bot out into the world, and so we have guardrails to make sure racist bot doesn't get released out into the world. And that's something we would be observing as well. It just, like, what are we observing when we observe this stuff? I would love to be able to play around with it more. Plus, we just need computational power in order to train these models, right? Not everybody has access. Maybe you guys have access to massive computers, but not everybody does, to like tweak the training data and see how that changes things. This is computationally, like, these are $1 million models, right, that are being built. You can't just build $50 million models and see how they're different. It's just not feasible to do that.
Yeah.
Computationally and money wise, it's not feasible. So static embeddings you can play around with, right? You can do all the poking and prodding you want. You cannot do that with the budgets that academics have. Even the budgets that OpenAI has, you can't really do that in any way. So
then
but
one thing that is sort of like a resonance on last week, where we had 40,000-year-old science systems. Going back to this topic of anachronisms, as you go back in time, one thing is very clear. Like, if you talk about the early phase of feminist theory, you know, Simone de Beauvoir, even early Butler, if you go back to sort of like early mathematics, if you go back to early machine learning, if you go to early whatever it is, you end up with a bunch of voices. It's a very few voices that probably are not representative of sort of like the whole situation. Like, for example, if we talk about racism in the 18th, 19th century United States, there is the same kind of like stuff that is always like brought up, but at the same time, you got like millions of people in a very broad landscape where lots of things may have happened. And anecdotally, you find good things and bad things. But nobody can draw the landscape because we don't have enough data points to draw the hurricane cone, so to speak. So how do we deal with that?
Yeah. How do we deal with the absences? Yeah, that's a huge problem, right? And so large language models, one of the challenges is they do require a lot of data to change any sort of behavior. And so if you're just adding a few data points, it's not going to change. This is the Titanic part of it, right? The ship is very, very hard to steer. You can't move it unless you have a ton of data. Or in some cases you can, right? In some unexpected ways, you can actually perturb the neural networks, and it does have a huge effect. We don't fully understand that yet, but we don't have absences. We don't have the data. If the data literally don't exist, we don't have it, right? And historians have dealt with that. One of the potential things we could do is simulate that data. If we have enough that we could build any sort of basis and then use a language model to simulate more of that, that could be exciting, right? Simulate more voices. Now that historians are going to go bonkers there and get really angry about that for good reason. So there's a lot of questions, right? But yeah, if the data don't exist, the data don't exist. You can't go back and make things that don't exist. Although we potentially can simulate stuff that don't exist now in very careful ways. But like, people were talking about using large language models to study the Vikings, right? The Vikings never wrote anything down. How are you going to use a large language model to study the Vikings who never wrote anything down, right? You can't just materialize data out of thin air, especially going back in history. So
I think this is where we need to be, like, I think it's a good moment to bring an example why simulation is really, really dangerous in culture. There is a classic example where there's like an island that still has hazelnuts, but there is like prehistoric deposits of hazelnut shells. And so basically the story was the humans were going on these sort of like log boats over, and then they would actually pick the hazelnuts and then like shell all of them and fill the boat with the shelled hazelnuts, because obviously you get more hazelnuts back to the mainland. And then there was an agent-based model, actually a whole class of agent-based models that people did, how to figure out how they forage these hazelnuts and actually how they did this and whatever. And one interesting things, they came up with a lot of like really nice things. And at the end, some old archaeologists lifted their hand, but that's not the distribution of hazelnuts on that island. And so that is sort of like one of the core issues, that if you don't have the island, if you don't have the shells, if you don't have the shrubs, and if you don't know what kind of boat they came over and how they foraged and whatever religion they had, because that may actually also have shaped what they do, then you cannot say anything. And so that is one of the key issues. If we use the models to simulate just because we can do simulation, in the same way that we do the semantic differentials because that's how these figures are drawn, but reality is more complex, actually the simulation may obfuscate the actual evidence that qualitatively makes much more sense in a sense. So how do we deal with that? That's like sort of like, and you don't need to answer, but that's like a question I asked myself ever since I heard this Hazelnut talk, sort of like, I don't know, 15 years ago or 18 years ago.
Yeah, it's science fiction, right? At that point, it's just science fiction. And science fiction can be very productive in terms of thinking about like different possible worlds, but it's not science. It's not like simulating anything real. It's just science fiction.
Andres lifted his hand.
Yeah, so you mentioned Vikings. So incidentally, I sometimes go to conferences where people talk very much about simulating Vikings and other medieval characters. So yes, in a sense, it feels like very new, and I'm also familiar with the literature you've been pointing at, like people trying to use these language models to simulate societies or communities and whatnot. And the need for historical research, this is much more difficult. But then again, it's not new at all from another angle. There's like whole schools of this computational humanities or computational history who are doing not like language or text-based simulations, but simulations of historical societies. There's entire subfield of language evolution, which I incidentally kind of am part of, or was at least, who do simulations of proto-language, which there is literally absolutely no written evidence left. So people have been doing this kind of agent-based simulations kind of actually for a while. I don't know if it might be interesting. Do you know Iza Romanovska? Iza with a Z.
Give some more context.
She does this sort of historical simulation, has been kind of like an outspoken proponent of simulating history, basically, using agent-based models.
I'm going to look that up. Yeah, so like classic agent-based modeling, right?
Depends what classic means now, but yeah, there's kind of like little agents, and if it's like something about with movement, then it's the turtles, and in that sense, yes. And they have kind of figured some things out. Like you have to be very clever about it, like very specific, kind of very controlled.
The kind of what I would call classic agent-based modeling is about reducing down to a few variables, right? You always reduce. So I saw an awesome talk on like how gender norms emerge using agent-based modeling. You use like three variables, right? And you can show that across hundreds of thousands of simulations, you always get some form of gender norms.
Okay, so that's it. Then you know what I mean. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all about reducing, right? Reduce down to a few explanatory variables. Now, large language models, we get the opposite, right? We get overly complex, potentially, interactions, too many variables, too many neurons, too many layers to actually understand what's happening. So yes, there's a long history of agent-based modeling that's about reducing down to a few variables and seeing how that impacts systems and comparing potentially what really happened or ideas about what happened. But this is very different as, do you call it Maximilian or Max, as you were saying, right? It's a different beast. It becomes science fiction very, very quickly. And so it's in some sense more accurate because humans are not reducible down to two variables. And that's what we like to do with classic agent-based modeling is reduce it down to 2 or 3 variables.
All models are wrong and so on.
I mean, all models are wrong, some are helpful, but
I mean, in a sense, you're right. The models themselves are more complex. If you do
way more complex.
if you need a thinking model in your simulation, if the agent actually needs a brain that is more complex than just like some Bayesian little formula, then yes. But then again, these models can be steered to only have very few outputs. Like you can just give them some tokens very high weight, and it only chooses between those. So you can kind of understand, right? So
you can, right? This is what we should be exploring. Yeah, exactly what we should be exploring, right? Is what do we need to do anything meaningful, and what does it give us beyond agent-based modeling, right? Why not just go back to the good old-fashioned agent-based modeling, which was very, very powerful and continues to be a very.
That is also a very good question. Sometimes
like why go to
model is just
I think there's one thing you brought in. There was one talk in your special issue which you mentioned that did evolutionary game theory. And one of the interesting things about agent-based models is that obviously you model two things. You model an interaction, which can happen on a lattice in a network, on a grid or whatever, on a torus. and on the other hand, you model the agent. And so one of the sort of like, if you sort of like hang out with people who do a lot of agent-based modeling, is like if you obviously raise the number of variables in your agent, you can fit anything. So it's this spherical cow problem that ideally they would have these sort of like mathematical models with a few variables that explain a little bit like preferential attachment in networks. While on the other hand, like obviously if you have a lot of parameters, you can do everything with it. But now this is sort of, I think, an interesting thing because agent-based models are really, really powerful. While at the same time, the reduction is sort of like also an issue because it's a convenience of the field. Like lots of economists, social scientists, they use these models, agent-based models, and also sort of like, simple evolutionary game theory-based models like prisoner's dilemma, whatever, where there's a sort of gradient between one and the other, because it's also convenient for them. You can solve the equations if you have only a bunch of parameters, but if you got like if you look at like the multidimensional space and the dynamics or happening in sort of something like an embedding, that over time you actually there's no way you're gonna simulate that. In the same way, you're not gonna simulate the turbulence in the rocket nozzle with an agent-based model. It's just not gonna happen. And I think that is one thing where I think what is actually would be really, really helpful would be a kind of map of what would be the kind of mathematical models and sort of like computational models that sort of even exist as a spectrum, and how are they helpful in what kind of situations? Because right now, I think it's a little bit like, let's talk very practical. Like if you submit something for peer review in a funding institution or something like that, if you send it to a crowd of evolutionary game theorists, a bunch of agent-based modelers, a bunch of complexity scientists, a bunch of machine learning, computational humanists, whatever, and you don't align, you will be out. But the key thing is actually a lot of the stuff that people come up with is possible, even though the reviewers wouldn't agree, because it lives in a different part of that spectrum. World. And actually all of it should be done, right?
Yes, all of it should be done. How do we get it published? Maybe we just put it on archive, but archive is being swamped by AI generated stuff. Yeah.
I think they just actually banned a couple of days ago to submit review articles that are not already in a journal under review.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. These are all the questions we should be asking and exploring. It's very expensive to explore this in the large language model sense. As I was just mentioning, it's just too hard to like play around with this. How do we know we're doing anything real? But this is precisely it, right? These are grounded in long-standing methods, agent-based modeling, vector space modeling, right? Cultural cartography. What is new about these methods? What does it give us that we didn't have before? Is it worth the battle with them because they are such huge, humongous beasts that we don't fully understand? I'm not sure it is worth it. I 100% think it's worth it. But how do we start to chip away at what these give us? I know that there's 5 minutes left, but my kid is starting to grumble upstairs. I'm really sorry. I'm gonna have to go figure out what's happening so we can get him
back to life.
Yeah.
Let me close the session. So we have had a fantastic time with you, Laura. This is amazing. We will have another Open Lab seminar in 2 weeks, not next week. And the next one will be Oleg Sobchuk, who is a freshly voted ERC starting grant leader. The week after, we will have Corinna Coupet, who is also a freshly elected starting grant recipient. And let me just say that it's not sort of seen widely that the same area of cultural humanities, history, whatever research has sort of these kind of grants. In this lineup this semester, there's 3 of those. So it seems to be recognized that cultural analysis is actually a thing that is actually sort of cool. There will be another that is not announced yet, another Open Lab seminar in the week after Corinna Coupet, which will be people from University of Amsterdam, and not the usual ones that you already know, but other ones that actually are more related to film, but also do cultural analysis, which was quite a surprise. And so that's it. And next week, no Open Lab seminar, but we will post the last 4 videos on YouTube, so you will remain entertained. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Greetings to the kid.